I gave my son $25,000 for a once-in-a-lifetime family cruise to Alaska, a trip I was supposed to be on to honor the memory of my late wife. But when we got to the airport, he looked me in the eye, told me there was a booking error, and said that I should just go home. They never intended for me to go. They just wanted my money and the perfect family photos without the old man in the background. 2 weeks later, when their ship returned to port, they found me and my lawyer waiting on the pier, holding the legal documents that would ensure they never saw another dime of my money again. Before we get into the story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what your dream vacation island. I'd genuinely love to hear about it. The whole thing started on a Tuesday at the same small community bank I've used for 40 years. I sat across from a teller named Susan, a kind woman who'd known me since my hair was more brown than gray. She looked at the cashier's check for $25,000 made out to the cruise line, then back at me, her smile warm. "This is it, Art," she said. "The big one. Eleanor would be so proud you're finally doing this." I just nodded, my throat a little tight. Eleanor, my wife of 43 years, had been the one who'd collected the brochures. Every winter, she'd spread them across our kitchen table, tracing the route of the Alaskan ships with her finger. "One day, Arthur," she'd say. "Just us, the mountains, and all that quiet." We never got that day. 2 years ago, I lost her to an illness that came on fast and cruel, and the brochures had gathered dust in a drawer ever since. When my son Caleb had suggested we all go as a family, him, his wife Jenna, and my 2 grandkids, it felt like a sign, a way to honor her memory and feel a part of something again. "It'll be for you, Dad," he'd said, his hand on my shoulder. A tribute to Mom. I believed him. I wanted to believe him so badly. So I wrote the check, not just for the cruise, but for everything. The shore excursions, the premium dining package, the travel insurance. I wanted them to have the world. At a family dinner the week before we were set to leave, Jenna couldn't stop talking about it. She was already planning her social media posts, describing the epic multi-generational journey we were about to have. She raised her glass of wine. To Dad, she'd announced with a beaming smile, for making these precious family memories possible. Caleb and the kids cheered, and in that moment, my heart felt fuller than it had in years. I saw Eleanor's smile in my granddaughter's face and thought, this is the right thing to do. This is what family is for. That last night at home, I pulled my old suitcase from the top of the closet. It was nothing fancy, just a hard-sided Samsonite from the 80s, but Eleanor had bought it for me for our 20th anniversary. It was covered in scuffs from dozens of job sites and a few fishing trips we'd managed to take over the years. It was sturdy, dependable, built to last. Like me. I packed my thickest sweaters, a pair of binoculars for whale watching, and tucked a small framed photo of Eleanor into the side pocket. As I zipped it shut, a deep sense of peace settled over me. I was about to embark on the trip she and I had always dreamed of, surrounded by the family I had spent my entire life building. I felt a profound sense of hope, completely unaware that my own son had already packed my bags for a very different journey, one that would lead straight back to this empty, silent house. The flight from Columbus to Seattle was filled with a buzzing energy. My grandson, Liam, spent the entire time with his face glued to the window, asking me if every mountain we passed was Mount Rainier, while Chloe, my granddaughter, carefully colored a picture of a whale to give to the ship's captain. Jenna was orchestrating the whole thing from her aisle seat, taking photos and short videos for her online followers. "Making memories," she'd chirp, aiming her phone's camera at me and the kids. I just smiled, feeling a genuine warmth spread through my chest. For the first time since Eleanor was gone, the silence in my life had been replaced by the happy chaos of family. I was the patriarch, the provider, the anchor. It was a role I had missed more than I ever admitted to myself. The Seattle-Tacoma airport was a different beast altogether, a massive, sprawling terminal teeming with people from every corner of the globe. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and the rumbling sound of thousands of rolling suitcases. Our gate for the Alaskan Cruise Line's private transfer was at the far end of the concourse, and the area was already packed with families wearing matching t-shirts and bubbling with vacation excitement. Jenna, of course, insisted on a group photo in front of the giant banner that read, "Gateway to the Last Frontier." Caleb seemed distracted. He kept checking his phone, his brow furrowed, barely cracking a smile for the picture. I figured it was just work stress. His marketing startup always seemed to be one crisis away from either booming or busting. I put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Son, leave the work behind. We're on vacation now." He gave me a tight, fleeting smile and said, "You're right, Dad. Let's get these bags checked." We joined the long snaking line, my old Samsonite suitcase standing in stark contrast to their sleek, matching set of four. The kids were getting restless, and Jenna was trying to keep them entertained while also touching up her makeup. It was in that moment of ordinary, chaotic family travel that Caleb turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice a little too quiet. "Can I talk to you for a second? Over here." He motioned toward a less crowded spot near a pillar, away from the check-in counter and Jenna's view. I followed, assuming he needed to ask me for some cash for baggage fees or some other minor thing. My wallet was already halfway out of my pocket. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the departures board overhead, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "So, Dad, there's a problem," he started, the words coming out slowly, as if he'd rehearsed them. "I don't know how to say this, but there was a booking error, a really bad one. The travel agent must have messed it up." I waited for him to continue, a knot of confusion tightening in my stomach. Around us, a family cheered as they saw their boarding group called. "What kind of error, Caleb?" I asked, my voice steady. "We can get it sorted at the counter. That's what they're there for." "Oh." He finally looked at me, but his eyes were flat, devoid of the panic I expected to see. "That's the thing," he said, shaking his head with a theatrical sigh. "I already called them. The ticket, your ticket, it just didn't go through. The cruise is completely sold out. There's no spot for you." The words hung in the air, thick and unbelievable. The noise of the airport seemed to fade into a dull roar. "What are you talking about?" My voice came out as a whisper. "The check cleared weeks ago. I have the receipt." I started to pat my coat pocket, the instinct to prove my place, to show my worth, kicking in. "I know, Dad, and I feel terrible," he said, but his voice lacked any real sympathy. "It's a disaster. But boarding is about to close, and Jenna and the kids are already checked in. There's nothing we can do." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few $100 bills, trying to press them into my hand. "Here. This is for a taxi back to the hotel and a flight home tomorrow. It's best if you just head home." And that's when I saw it. As I looked past his empty words and into his eyes, I didn't see panic. I didn't see frustration or disappointment. I saw relief. It was a flicker, a momentary relaxation of the muscles around his eyes, but it was there. It was the look of a man whose difficult task was finally over. In that instant, I saw Jenna across the way, deliberately turning her back to us, intensely focused on zipping up Chloe's jacket. She knew all along. The money in his hand felt like the ultimate insult. The check for $25,000, the family dinners, the talk of honoring Eleanor's memory, it was all a lie. A carefully constructed performance to get my money without the inconvenience of my presence. I didn't take the cash. I couldn't move. My hand just fell to my side. Caleb's face hardened. "Look, we have to go, or we'll miss the transfer," he said, his tone shifting from fake sympathy to impatience. He stuffed the bills into my coat pocket and turned away. "I'm sorry, Dad. We'll call you from the ship." He walked back to his family, gathered them up, and led them through the gate without a single look back. I stood there by the pillar, a forgotten statue in the middle of a bustling terminal, watching my family, my whole world disappear down the jet bridge, leaving me alone with nothing but the echo of his words. "Just go home." For how long I stood there, I couldn't tell you. The world moved on around me. Announcements for flights to Dallas and Tokyo crackled over the PA system. Children squealed with delight. The scent of Cinnabon hung in the air, but I was frozen in place, an island of stillness in a river of motion. My son's final words, "We'll call you from the ship," echoed in my head, each word a little colder, a little more hollow than the last. My mind, the practical mind of a man who'd spent his life measuring twice and cutting once, was desperately trying to find a different angle, a different explanation. A mistake. It had to be a mistake. Caleb was stressed. He'd gotten confused. He'd panicked. Any reason would be better than the one I saw in his eyes. My legs finally unlocked, moving with a will of their own. I left my suitcase by the pillar. That old, faithful companion now felt like a block of concrete chained to my wrist, and walked toward the cruise line's check-in counter. The line had thinned out, and a woman with a kind face and a name tag that read Maria was tidying up her station. She looked up as I approached, her professional smile faltering slightly as she took in my expression. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice gentle. I had to clear my throat to speak. Yes, I said, the word coming out raspy. My son, my family was just here, the Vance party. He said there was an error with my ticket. I was hoping you could just double check. I was clinging to that word, error, like a life raft. She nodded sympathetically. Of course, it happens. What's the last name again? Vance, I repeated. Arthur Vance. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. She squinted at the screen for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. The silence stretched on, filled only by the distant hum of the terminal. Okay, I see the reservation right here, she said, turning the monitor slightly so I could see. Vance party, staterooms 814 and 816, sailing to Alaska today. The screen showed their names listed out, a neat row of betrayal. Caleb Vance, Jenna Vance, Liam Vance, Chloe Vance. And then, a fifth name, Brenda, Jenna's sister. Not me, my name wasn't there at all. I see 5 guests on the booking, Maria said, her voice softening with pity. She knew. She could see the story on my face. My son, I started, my own voice sounding foreign. He said my ticket didn't go through, that the booking failed. She scrolled down the screen, her expression becoming more somber. She hesitated for a second, as if debating whether to tell me. Then, she seemed to make a decision. Sir, she said, looking me directly in the eye, I don't see any record of a 6th ticket ever being attached to this reservation. It looks like the booking was made this way from the very start, about 9 weeks ago, for 5 passengers. I'm not seeing any changes or cancellations made since then. 9 weeks. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. 9 weeks ago was right after I'd transferred the $25,000 into Caleb's account. It wasn't an error. It wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. A cold, calculated 9-week-long deception. Every family dinner since, every conversation about what we'd do in Juneau, every cheer of "to Dad" was a lie. The air left my lungs, and my hand shot out to grip the edge of the counter to keep myself steady. The kindness in Maria's eyes was almost unbearable. Sir, are you all right? Is there someone I can call for you? She asked, her voice laced with genuine concern. A stranger was showing me more compassion than my own son had. I shook my head, unable to form words, and mumbled a thank you. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, a witness to a quiet, pathetic little tragedy. The journey back through the terminal was a blur. I retrieved my suitcase and began the long, shameful walk toward the exit signs. Every happy family I passed, every group of friends laughing, felt like a personal mockery. I was a ghost haunting my own vacation. I took a taxi not to a hotel, but straight back to the airport's main terminal to book the first flight back to Ohio in the morning. I spent the night in a hard plastic chair near the baggage claim, my suitcase at my feet, the photo of Eleanor in the side pocket, feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The flight home the next day was the longest 4 hours of my life. As the plane climbed over the majestic, snow-capped peaks of the Pacific Northwest, the very mountains I was supposed to be seeing from the deck of a cruise ship with my family, the full clarity of the situation washed over me. I replayed every conversation. Caleb's insistence on handling all the bookings himself, because it was easier that way. Jenna's casual comment a month ago about how their stateroom had a pull-out couch, perfect for Brenda. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of such profound greed and cruelty that it made me physically sick. They didn't just want my money. They wanted my wife's dream, and they had surgically removed me from it. When I finally arrived back at my house in Columbus, the sun was setting. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was exactly as I'd left it less than 48 hours before, but it felt entirely different. The welcoming silence I had once cherished now felt like a crushing, suffocating void. I dropped my old suitcase on the welcome mat, the thud echoing through the empty rooms. The trip was over. I was home. And I had never, ever in my 69 years felt so utterly and completely alone. That first night back was a waking nightmare. I didn't unpack. I didn't turn on the television or the radio. I just walked through the rooms of the house I'd built with my own 2 hands, each one a museum of a life that suddenly felt like a lie. The silence was a physical presence, pressing in on me, amplifying the sound of my own hollow breathing. Every object screamed Eleanor's absence and my family's betrayal. Her favorite armchair sat empty by the window, the Afghan she knitted draped over its back. On the fridge, a child's drawing of our family held on by a magnet, a smiling stick figure of Grandpa Art felt like a cruel joke. I eventually ended up in the living room, staring at the photos lined up on the mantelpiece, a timeline of my own foolishness. There was Caleb at his high school graduation, his arm around me, beaming with pride. Had he been planning this even then? Seeing me not as a father, but as a stepping stone? There was his wedding photo, with a young, hopeful Jenna looking at him like he was the world. Was her smile genuine then, or was she already calculating the value of the family she was marrying into? I picked up the largest photo, one of my favorites, taken on my 65th birthday. Eleanor was still with me then, her head resting on my shoulder, her eyes sparkling. Caleb and Jenna stood behind us, their kids in their arms. We looked like the perfect family, the kind of family people dream of. I stared at my son's smiling face in the picture, searching for a hint of the cold-eyed stranger who had dismissed me at the airport. I couldn't find him. That's what hurt the most. The man who destroyed me wasn't a monster. He was my own son, hidden in plain sight for years. I put the photo back, my fingers trembling, the grief a raw, open wound in my chest. I didn't sleep. When the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the blinds, I couldn't stand being inside the suffocating quiet of the house for a second longer. I opened the back door and stepped out onto the patio. The cool morning air was a welcome shock. Before me was Eleanor's garden, her proudest creation. It was the one part of our home that was entirely hers. I had built the raised beds and laid the stone path, but she had brought the life to it. Even now, 2 years after she was gone, her roses were still blooming, her lavender still fragrant. But as I looked closer, I saw the signs of my own neglect. In the weeks I'd spent poring over cruise brochures and planning with the family, I'd let things slide. Thistles and bittercress were starting to creep in around the edges of the beds, their insidious roots threatening to choke out the peonies she loved so much. The sight of those weeds sparked something in me. It was a feeling more potent than grief, more focused than despair. It was anger. A cold, quiet anger that started in my gut and spread through my veins. This garden was Eleanor's legacy. It was the last pure, untainted piece of her I had left, and I was letting it be overrun. I was letting the weeds win. Without thinking, I knelt on the damp earth, my old knees protesting, and plunged my hands into the soil. I grabbed the base of a thick thistle and pulled. Its spiny stalk resisted, but I clenched my jaw and ripped it from the ground, its deep, stubborn root finally giving way. I threw it aside and moved to the next one, and the next. For hours, I worked. The sun rose higher, warming my back, but I didn't notice. My mind went quiet, my focus narrowed to the simple, physical task at hand. My hands, the hands that had framed houses and built cabinets, were now covered in dirt, doing the hard work of tearing out what didn't belong. With every weed I pulled, it felt like I was ripping out a piece of the poison that Caleb had planted in my soul. This one was for the lie about the booking error. This one was for the flicker of relief in his eyes. This one was for the way Jenna turned her back. This one was for the $25,000. I remembered something Eleanor used to say as she worked in this very spot, her face smudged with dirt. "You can't be sentimental about weeds, Arthur," she'd say, pointing with her trowel. "They look harmless, but they'll steal the life from everything you love if you let them. You have to be ruthless." When I finally finished, I stood up slowly, my back aching, and looked at the pile of uprooted weeds I had created. It was a monument to my own inaction. I had been sentimental. I had let the weeds grow in my own family, ignoring the signs, hoping they would sort themselves out. I had funded a lifestyle, not a life. I had enabled entitlement instead of encouraging integrity. My son's betrayal wasn't a sudden storm. It was a rot that I had allowed to fester for years. I looked at my dirt-caked hands and then back at the garden, now clean and orderly, the flowers standing tall in the morning light. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my heart, but it was no longer the only thing I felt. Alongside it was a cold, hard clarity, a builder's resolve. The foundation of my family was rotten, and when a foundation is rotten, you don't patch it. You tear it down and build something new, something strong, something that will last. I went back inside, washed my hands, and for the first time in days, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. The sun was high in the sky by the time I came back inside, but the day felt new. The oppressive weight of the grief hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, making room for the cold, solid feeling of purpose. I walked past the living room, ignoring the gallery of smiling photos on the mantelpiece, and went straight to my small home office. This room was my sanctuary, a place of order and logic. An old oak desk I'd built myself stood against the far wall, its surface clear except for a lamp and a framed photo of Eleanor and me standing proudly in front of the first house I ever built. The walls were lined with shelves holding neatly organized binders and decades of financial records. In here, emotions were secondary to facts, and for the first time since I'd stepped into that airport, facts were what I needed. I didn't just grab the phone and dial. That's not how I work. First, I prepared. I opened my filing cabinet and pulled the folder I'd labeled Alaskan Cruise. Inside was every piece of documentation. The original brochure Eleanor had dog-eared, the detailed itinerary, and the bank statement showing the wire transfer of $25,000 from my savings account to Caleb's. I laid them out on the desk in a neat line. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. This was a transaction. A contract that had been breached not in its lettering, but in its spirit. I found the cruise line's corporate number, bypassing the general customer service line. I'd learned long ago in my business that if you want a real answer, you go to the source. I took a deep breath, looked at Eleanor's smiling face in the photo, and dialed. After navigating a short automated menu, a polite but professional voice answered. Executive Guest Services, this is David speaking. How can I help you? I kept my own voice low and steady, completely devoid of the emotion that was churning in my gut. Good morning, David. My name is Arthur Vance. I am calling in regard to a booking for the Vance party, reservation number 77B415. I gave him the details with calm precision. I am the financial guarantor for this entire package, and I am calling to cancel it, all of it, effective immediately. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the soft clicking of a keyboard. Okay, Mr. Vance, I have the reservation right here, David said, his tone shifting into a well-trained, placating cadence. I see it's our signature 2-week land and sea package. That's a truly remarkable trip. Are you sure you want to cancel? We could perhaps look at rescheduling for a later date. No, I said, the word flat and final. I will not be rescheduling. The trip is to be canceled. He tried another angle. I understand, sir. Sometimes plans change. For a cancellation of this magnitude, perhaps I can offer a significant onboard credit for a future cruise. You wouldn't want to lose the value of this amazing vacation package. I could picture him in some polished office, reading from a script designed to save a sale. He had no idea what he was dealing with. David, I said, my voice dropping even lower, becoming as hard and immovable as granite. The reason for the cancellation is a complete withdrawal of the funding source. The package will be canceled today. The sales pitch tone in his voice vanished, replaced by a formal seriousness. I understand, Mr. Vance. I do need to inform you that canceling this close to the departure date will incur a significant financial penalty. According to the terms and conditions, the cancellation fee will be 20% of the total package price. I did the math in my head instantly. $5,000. A sum of money that would have made me sick to my stomach just a week ago. $5,000 to erase a dream, but it felt like a bargain. It was the price of my dignity. That is acceptable, I said without a moment's hesitation. Please proceed. The finality in my voice left him with nowhere else to go. Very well, sir, he said, and I could hear him typing again, the click sounding like a judge's gavel. The reservation has been canceled. The refund, minus the $5,000 penalty, will be processed and returned to the original payment card within 5 to 7 business days. My heart hammered in my chest. Caleb had used his own credit card to book the trip after I transferred him the money, a detail he'd insisted on for points and rewards. The refund would go to him, but the reservations for the hotels, the private tours, the seaplane excursion, everything I'd paid for would vanish into thin air. You'll receive an email confirmation of this cancellation within the hour, David concluded. Is there anything else I can assist you with today? No, David, I said quietly. You've done everything I needed. I hung up the phone and sat back in my chair, the silence of the office settling around me once more. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel vengeful glee. I felt a quiet, somber sense of empowerment. It was the feeling of a surgeon after a difficult but necessary amputation. The limb was gone, and the pain was real, but the poison had been cut out. An hour later, just as he'd promised, an email arrived. Subject, Cancellation confirmation. Reservation 77B415. I printed it, three-hole punched it, and placed it neatly at the front of the file. It was the first page in a new chapter. The first move had been made. Now, all I had to do was wait. The 2 days that followed were some of the quietest I'd experienced since Eleanor passed. But it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the lonely, echoing silence of grief. It was the calm, patient silence of a hunter in a blind. I went about my life with a new, deliberate rhythm. I spent the mornings in Eleanor's garden, not just weeding, but pruning her roses and staking up the peonies. I paid my monthly bills, organized my workshop, and even took a drive out to the cemetery to sit with her for a while. I told her what I'd done, my words quiet in the peaceful afternoon air. They thought we were weak, Ellie, I whispered, laying a fresh rose from her garden on the cool granite of her headstone. They forgot who we are. Through it all, my phone remained on the kitchen counter, screen down, on silent. I knew Caleb had my number for the satellite phone I'd insisted they take for emergencies, but I felt no compulsion to check it. Their world, for the moment, was a million miles away. They were floating through majestic fjords, dining in luxurious halls, and sleeping in comfortable beds, completely oblivious. They were living out a fantasy I had paid for, and I was living in a reality they had created. I felt a strange sense of peace in that. I had set my plan in motion, like a carpenter setting a support beam in place. Now, all I had to do was wait for the weight of their choices to settle upon it. The wait ended at 6:15 on a Thursday morning. I was in the kitchen, watching my old percolator bubble on the counter, the rich smell of coffee slowly filling the house. I had slept soundly for the first time in what felt like a year. As I reached for my favorite mug, my eyes fell on the phone. Its screen was dark, but I knew the time difference. It would be 2:15 in the morning in Alaska. The first leg of their land tour was supposed to start yesterday in Ketchikan. Curiosity finally got the better of me. I picked up the device and pressed the home button. The screen exploded with light, a blinding supernova of notifications. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust. A cascade of banners and alerts covered every inch of the screen. 72 missed calls, 14 new voicemails, 48 new text messages. The numbers were staggering. It was a digital avalanche of panic. I poured my coffee, added a splash of cream, and sat down at the kitchen table, the warm mug a comforting weight in my hands. Then, with a steady finger, I began to scroll. The messages painted a vivid, real-time portrait of a vacation and a family, completely unraveling. It started with confusion, a single text from Caleb sent late the previous afternoon. "Dad, weird question, but did you change the hotel booking in Ketchikan? Call me." An hour later, the tone had shifted. This one was from Jenna. "Art, Caleb said he texted you. The hotel has no record of us, at all. They're saying our entire land tour package has been canceled. This has to be a mistake. You need to call the cruise line and fix this." Oh. Then, the deluge began. The timestamps growing closer and closer together as midnight passed in their time zone. From Caleb. "Dad, pick up the phone. The tour operator for the Misty Fjords trip just left. We're stranded at the dock with the kids and all our luggage." From Jenna's sister, Brenda. "Arthur, what on earth is going on? Jenna is in tears. We have nowhere to stay, and it's the middle of the night." From Caleb, his messages now laced with fury. "I swear if you did this, on purpose you will regret it." And then, the one that made it all worthwhile, sent at 2 in the morning, their time, just a few hours ago. "I know you did this. You vindictive old man, you've ruined everything for your own grandchildren. What did you do?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The liquid was hot and slightly bitter, a perfect contrast to the cold satisfaction spreading through me. There it was, the blame, the rage, the accusations, but not a single word of apology, not a hint of self-reflection. They weren't angry that they had betrayed me. They were furious that their betrayal had consequences. They weren't stranded because of their cruelty, but because I had refused to continue paying for it. I scrolled to the very last message, one from Jenna, a pathetic attempt to play the only card she had left. "Art, please. The kids are crying, they're cold, and they don't understand. Whatever is going on, we just need you to fix it. Please. Fix it." After they had broken everything, they still expected me to be the one to fix it. I read the message one last time, then set my phone back down on the table, screen down, The storm was raging thousands of miles away, but in my kitchen, the only sound was the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall. The power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the one left behind. I was the one who was home, at peace, in control. I took another sip of my coffee and looked out the window at Eleanor's garden, bathed in the calm light of a new day. Ngwun. I let the phone ring. It had started again around 7 o'clock, a persistent, desperate buzz from the kitchen counter. I finished my coffee, read the morning paper cover to cover, and solved half of the crossword puzzle. Each time the phone went silent, a new voicemail notification would pop up. Each time it started ringing again, it was from a different number, Caleb's, then Jenna's, then an unknown Alaskan number I presumed belonged to her sister. They were coordinating their attack, passing the phone between them like a hot potato. They were treating this like a problem of logistics, of pressure, assuming that if they were just persistent enough, I would crack. They still didn't understand that the man they were trying to reach, the soft-hearted father and grandfather, no longer existed. Around 9 o'clock, after I'd showered and dressed, I decided I was ready. I wasn't going to let them dictate my day with their incessant ringing. I walked into my office, the legal pad and the Alaskan cruise file already sitting neatly on my desk. I pulled out a heavy, black fountain pen, a gift from Eleanor for my 50th birthday, and uncapped it. I sat down in my sturdy leather chair, took a centering breath, and waited. As if on cue, the phone began to ring again. It was Caleb. This time, I answered. The connection was poor, filled with static and a faint whistling wind, but the rage in his voice came through with perfect clarity. "Finally," he shouted, the word distorted by the bad signal. "I have been calling you for hours. What did you do? Do you have any idea what you've done?" In the background, I could hear one of the kids crying, and Jenna's sister, Brenda, yelling something about credit cards being declined. It was a symphony of chaos, and I was its silent composer. I held the phone slightly away from my ear and waited for his initial tirade to run out of steam. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke, my voice as calm and even as a placid lake. "Hello, Caleb. It sounds like you're having some trouble with your accommodations." The sheer normalcy of my tone seemed to stun him into a moment of silence. Then he exploded again. "Trouble, trouble. Dad, we are stranded in Ketchikan. The hotel, the tours, the seaplane ride, it's all gone. We spent the night in the lobby of a fishing lodge. The kids slept on a couch. This isn't a game." I picked up my pen. On the top of the legal pad, I wrote the date and the time. "I'm not playing a game, son," I said, my voice maintaining its placid, infuriating calm. "I simply canceled my funding for the trip. The vacation you are currently on is the one you chose to take when you left me standing alone at the Seattle airport. I'm just not paying for that one." I could hear him sputtering, trying to form a response. That's not the same thing. That was a mistake. This is cruel. You're punishing your own grandchildren because your feelings got hurt." My pen moved across the page as he spoke. Punishing grandchildren, feelings hurt. Every word he said simply confirmed the rightness of my decision. "Let me ask you a question, Caleb. When you took my $25,000, was that money for a family vacation?" There was a brief pause. "Yes, of course it was," he shot back. "And am I not family?" I asked, the question hanging in the air between Ohio and Alaska. The silence that followed was more damning than any answer. He couldn't argue with the simple, brutal truth of it. So he changed tactics, falling back on the one he knew best, aggression. "You know what? I don't have time for this," he snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just a bitter old man, sitting alone in that empty house, trying to ruin things for everyone else because you've got nothing left. Well, you will regret this. I swear to you, when I get back to Ohio, you are going to regret this." I wrote down his words carefully and clearly. "Bitter old man, you will regret this." The threat was so pure, so undiluted in its entitlement, he genuinely believed he had the right to threaten me after stealing from me. "Could you clarify that, Caleb?" I asked, my voice still perfectly level. "The connection is poor. You said I'm a bitter old man and that I will regret this. Is that correct?" Hearing his own ugly words repeated back to him so clinically seemed to set him off even more. "You heard me. Actions have consequences," he yelled. "You're absolutely right," I agreed, a flicker of genuine disgust rising in my chest. "That's what this is all about." Suddenly the phone was fumbled, and Jenna's tearful voice came on the line. "Art, Art, please, she sobbed. Listen to him. Liam won't stop crying. He keeps asking why we can't go see the Eagles. You can't do this to him, to the kids. They're innocent. Whatever you think Caleb did, you can't punish them for it. It was a masterful performance, but the curtain had already been pulled back. I knew who she was. I thought of the children, Jenna, I said, my voice hardening for the first time. I thought of them when I paid for a vacation that you and your husband decided they should take without their grandfather. This problem is not my responsibility. You are their parents. It's up to you to solve it. I heard her gasp, and the phone was snatched back by Caleb. He was yelling again, something about lawyers, about declaring me incompetent, but I had heard enough. I had everything I needed. It seems we have nothing more to discuss, I said, cutting through his tirade. You are a grown man, Caleb. You have a family and a credit card. I am sure you can figure out your own travel arrangements from here. Before he could respond, I continued. Do not call me again. I pressed the end call button, and the line went dead, severing the connection. I placed the phone gently back in its cradle. The office was perfectly silent again. I looked down at the legal pad in front of me, at my son's threats written in my own steady hand. The disgust was a cold, heavy weight inside me. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. This was about justice, and I now had the evidence I needed to pursue it. The morning after the phone call, I woke up with a singular, unshakable focus. The disgust from the previous day had burned away the last remnants of my grief, leaving behind the cold, hard steel of resolve. This was no longer just about a ruined vacation or a broken heart. Caleb's threats had changed the very nature of the conflict. He had promised consequences, and I was a man who believed in taking people at their word. It was time to build my defense. More than that, it was time to build a case. My first call wasn't to a lawyer. It was to my oldest friend, Frank Donatelli. Frank and I had started in the construction trade together 50 years ago, and he was the only man I knew whose moral compass was as true as his level. I told him a sanitized version of the story, focusing on the financial aspects and the threats. He listened without interruption, and when I was done, he was silent for a long moment. Art, he finally said, his voice a low growl. The boy's a leech. You need someone who knows how to deal with leeches. Don't call that family lawyer you've always used. He's too soft. I've got a name for you, Evelyn Reed. My nephew used her for a nasty business dispute. She's not cheap, and she doesn't hold your hand, but she's sharp as a razor, and she does not lose. That was all I needed to hear. Before I even called Miss Reed's office to make an appointment, I knew I couldn't walk in there with just a sad story. A good lawyer needs more than emotion. They need evidence. They need a blueprint. For the next 3 days, my office became a command center. I pulled out decades of financial records, dusty boxes filled with canceled checks, bank statements, and loan agreements. It was a painful archaeological dig into my own willful blindness. At first, I was just looking for the big things, but soon I realized the true story was in the small, consistent pattern of dependency I had enabled. It was all there, in black and white. The statements showing the $1,500 I'd transferred to Caleb's account every month for the first 5 years of his marriage, initially for rent help, but which had quietly morphed into a permanent subsidy. The loan agreement for his first tech startup, a $50,000 disaster that I had co-signed and, inevitably, paid off in full when it folded. I found the hospital bill for $18,000 for Jenna's necessary cosmetic surgery that their insurance had refused to cover, which I'd paid directly to avoid them getting into debt. It went on and on. Checks for private school tuition, receipts for music lessons, and expensive summer camps for the grandkids, even credit card statements showing I'd paid for their last 3 family vacations to Florida. I didn't just collect the papers. I opened a spreadsheet on my computer, something I hadn't done in years, and began to build my case. I created columns for the date, the amount, the purpose, and a brief note. Each entry was a small cut, a paper trail of my love and their exploitation. As the list grew, so did the number at the bottom of the page. By the time I was finished, the total was staggering. Over the last 10 years alone, I had given them more than $400,000, not including the latest $25,000. I stared at the number on the screen, feeling the full weight of my own foolish generosity. I had been trying to buy a family, and all I had managed to create was a monster of entitlement. When I finally walked into the downtown offices of Reed and Associates a week later, I was not a grieving father. I was a client. The office was modern and minimalist, all glass and steel, a world away from the warm oak of my home. Evelyn Reed was exactly as Frank had described. She was a woman in her late 40s with a sharp, intelligent gaze and not a hint of sentimentality in her demeanor. She shook my hand firmly and gestured for me to sit. "Frank Donatelli speaks very highly of you, Mr. Vance," she began. "He said you have a problem that needs a structural solution. Tell me what's going on." "Oh," I laid my case out on her polished mahogany desk with the same precision I would use to lay out a blueprint. I started with the legal pad from the phone call, placing it squarely in front of her. "Last Thursday, my son threatened me. These are his words, verbatim." Her eyes scanned the page, her expression unreadable. Next, I placed the Alaskan cruise folder next to it, with the bank statement and the cancellation confirmation on top. Finally, I pushed the spreadsheet across the desk toward her, followed by a thick binder containing the most damning of the financial documents. "And this," I said, my voice steady, "is the pattern." She spent the next 20 minutes in silence, reading. She scanned the spreadsheet, her eyes moving from the threats on the legal pad to the staggering total at the bottom of the page, and back again. She occasionally picked up a document from the binder, verifying a number or a date. When she was finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something beyond professional interest in her eyes. It was respect. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice crisp and clear, "this isn't just a family dispute over a vacation. What you have meticulously documented here is a textbook case of long-term financial exploitation culminating in a direct threat. This gives us a great deal of legal leverage. What precisely is your desired outcome?" I looked past her, out the large window at the city skyline. All those buildings, all those structures, were built on solid foundations. Mine was not. "I don't want to sue him. I don't want his money," I said, turning back to face her. "I want to protect what's left of the legacy my wife and I built. I want to make sure that when I'm gone, it goes to building something good in the world, not to funding a lifestyle. I want him legally and irrevocably cut off." Evelyn Reed allowed herself a small, thin smile. "Mr. Vance," she said, folding her hands on the desk, "I believe we can build a fortress around your estate that not even the most determined sledgehammer could breach. Let's get to work." Our next meeting was less of a consultation and more of an architectural session. I sat across from Evelyn Reed in her glass-walled conference room, a panoramic view of the Columbus skyline behind her. The legal pad with Caleb's threats was no longer on the table. In its place were drafts of legal documents, flowcharts for trusts, and binders on Ohio estate law. The work of tearing down was done. Now, we would begin to build. "Legally speaking, disinheritance is straightforward," Evelyn began, her tone crisp and direct. "We draft a new last will and testament that explicitly excludes your son, and we create a corresponding trust to manage your assets. The key is to make it unassailable. We will include a specific clause detailing the reasons for the exclusion, referencing the documented pattern of financial exploitation and the verbal threats you recorded. This creates a clear narrative of your intent, which makes it incredibly difficult for a probate judge to overturn." I nodded, absorbing the technical details. It was a solid plan, a fortress, just as she'd promised. But as she spoke, a question began to form in my mind. Cutting Caleb out felt necessary, it felt just, but it also felt incomplete. It was a solution born from injury, an act of prevention. It wasn't an act of creation. It was a foundation with nothing built on top of it. "And the assets," I asked, looking at the city behind her. "Where do they go?" "That's the question you need to answer, Mr. Vance," she said, leaning forward. "Typically, clients in your position will designate other family members or a selection of established charities. I thought about that. I had no other family to speak of, and while giving to a big, anonymous charity was a fine idea, it felt impersonal. It didn't feel like a legacy. It felt like a transaction." Evelyn seemed to sense my hesitation. "Let me ask you this," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Forget about your son for a moment. What did you and your wife value? What did you spend your lives building, besides money?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything. What had we valued? I thought of my hands, calloused and scarred from 50 years of work. I thought of the scent of fresh-cut lumber, the satisfaction of a perfectly joined corner, the quiet pride of standing back and looking at a house I had built, knowing it would shelter a family for 100 years. I thought of Eleanor, who never cared about fancy cars or designer clothes, but who cherished the solid, beautiful things we built together. Our home, our garden, our reputation for honesty and hard work. We hadn't built a portfolio, we'd built a life. My son, with his vague digital marketing and his desperate need for the appearance of success, would never understand that. Hard work, I said finally, the words feeling solid and real in the quiet room. Skill. We valued making something real, something you can touch. My son, his generation, they seem to think that's beneath them. They want to be influencers and day traders. Nobody wants to learn how to build a wall straight and true anymore, and we're losing something because of that. As I spoke, the idea began to form, like a blueprint unrolling in my mind. It was so clear, so right, I couldn't believe I hadn't thought of it before. That's where I want it to go, I said, a new energy in my voice. I don't want to just give the money away. I want to invest it in the future, in kids who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty. Evelyn was listening intently, a small, knowing smile now playing on her lips. I want to create a scholarship, I continued, the vision becoming clearer with every word. For students at the trade schools and community colleges here in Ohio, for kids who want to become carpenters, electricians, plumbers, welders, the ones who are going to build the next generation of this city. We'll pay for their tuition, for their tools, for their certification exams. I looked at Evelyn, my heart full for the first time in weeks. We'll call it the Arthur and Eleanor Vance Scholarship for the Skilled Trades. Eleanor would have loved that. It honors what we really were. It's a legacy that builds. The room was silent for a moment as she let the weight of my words settle. This was the true tribute to my wife's memory. Not a cruise ship sailing past glaciers, but a generation of young builders hammering nails and wiring homes, their futures made a little easier because of the life we had lived. Evelyn Reed finally nodded, her professional composure giving way to genuine warmth. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice filled with a newfound respect. "That is the single best, most poetic use of a family trust I have ever had the privilege of working on. It's more than a fortress, it's a monument." She picked up her pen. "Let's start drawing up the plans." I left her office that day feeling like a different man. The weight of Caleb's betrayal was still there, but it was no longer the central pillar of my existence. I wasn't just the man who had been wronged. I was an architect again, about to start work on my final and most important project. A week later, I found myself back in Evelyn Reed's glass-walled conference room. The atmosphere this time was markedly different. The creative energy of our last meeting had been replaced by a quiet, formal gravity. It was no longer just the two of us. Two of her associates, a young man and a woman I hadn't met, sat at the far end of the table, their hands folded neatly before them. A certified notary public, an older woman with a serious demeanor, was arranging her stamps and ledger. And in the corner of the room, a small, unobtrusive video camera stood on a tripod, its single red light glowing like a watchful eye. The document lay in the center of the polished table. It was a thick, heavy stack of paper, bound in a simple blue cover. My new last will and testament. The blueprint we had designed was now ready for its foundation to be poured. Evelyn began the proceedings, her voice clear and formal for the benefit of the camera and the record. "Mr. Vance, we are here today, on the 8th of September, 2025, to execute your new will. For the record, the purpose of the witnesses, the notary, and this video recording is to create a clear and indisputable record of your intent and your mental state at the time of signing. This is to ensure your final wishes are protected from any potential future contest." She was speaking to me, but her words were aimed at a hypothetical courtroom, at a future judge, and most pointedly, at my son. She gestured for me to look into the camera. "Mr. Vance, for the record, could you please state your full name and confirm that you are here today of your own free will?" I looked directly into the lens, picturing Caleb's face on the other side. "My name is Arthur William Vance," I said, my voice steady and strong. "I am here today entirely of my own free will, under no coercion or influence from anyone." Evelyn continued with a series of questions. Had I read the entire document? Did I understand that it revoked all previous wills and testaments? Did I understand that it completely and irrevocably disinherited my only son, Caleb Vance? To each question, I answered with a simple, powerful, "Yes, I do." There was no hesitation. In the quiet of my own home over the past week, I had wrestled with the last vestiges of doubt and sentimentality. I had mourned the son I wished I had, and I had finally, fully accepted the reality of the son I did have. This was not an act of anger, it was an act of preservation. It was the only way to honor the lifetime of love and hard work that Eleanor and I had shared. Finally, the moment came. Evelyn pushed the document in front of me, open to the final page. "If you are ready, Mr. Vance, you may now sign." I picked up the heavy fountain pen she offered, the same one I'd used to take notes during Caleb's threatening phone call. I looked down at the signature line, my name already typed neatly beneath it. For a fraction of a second, the face of a little boy with blonde hair, holding my hand at a construction site, flashed through my mind. A pang of a deep, ancient grief echoed in my chest. This signature was a final goodbye, an amputation of a part of my own heart. But then I saw Eleanor's face, smiling at me from the garden, and I remembered the weeds. "You have to be ruthless." My hand was perfectly steady as I signed my name. The ink was dark and permanent against the crisp white paper. It was done. I capped the pen and laid it down. The two associates were called forward to sign as witnesses, their signatures a testament to my clarity and purpose. The notary then took the document, reviewed the signatures, and with a solid, satisfying thud, pressed her official seal into the page. The act was complete. It was legally binding. It was final. Evelyn carefully placed the original document into a thick envelope destined for their firm's fireproof vault. She handed me a sealed copy. "Keep this in a safe place, Art," she said, using my first name for the first time. The weight of the envelope in my hand was substantial. It felt like a shield. Walking out of her office building and into the bright afternoon sun, I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel victorious. I felt a profound, unshakable sense of finality. A heavy door had been swung shut and bolted from my side. The path I had chosen was a lonely one, but for the first time in a very long time, it was truly, completely my own. I had taken back control of my story, and whatever happened next, the ending would be written on my terms. 2 weeks passed. The silence from Alaska was absolute. After that one explosive phone call, I had heard nothing. Not a single text, not a voicemail, not an email. It was as if my son and his family had fallen off the face of the earth. I knew they were still there, of course. I imagined them scrambling to find last-minute lodging in overpriced tourist towns, paying for everything on credit cards that were likely groaning under the strain. I pictured the arguments, the stress, the recriminations between Caleb and Jenna, and the quiet, simmering resentment from her sister and brother-in-law, whose own vacation had been collateral damage in my son's grand deception. I took no pleasure in these imaginings. I simply acknowledged them as the predictable results of a flawed design. During that time, I moved forward. I had a long and productive meeting with the dean of the local community college, planting the first seeds for the Arthur and Eleanor Vance Scholarship. I spent my days in the garden and my evenings reading, the quiet of the house gradually becoming a comfort again rather than a torment. I was preparing myself, shoring up my emotional foundations for the storm I knew was coming. Today was the day their flight was scheduled to return. Today was the day of the homecoming. The arrivals hall at the John Glenn Columbus International Airport was a chaotic mix of emotions. A group of college kids held up a hand-painted "Welcome Home" sign for a friend. A young soldier was being embraced by his weeping mother. Balloons bobbed in the air, and the low murmur of happy reunions filled the space. Amidst it all, Evelyn Reed and I stood as an island of quiet purpose. She was dressed in a sharp, dark gray business suit, a slim leather portfolio held loosely in one hand. I was in my best tweed jacket, the one Eleanor had always liked. We weren't here to celebrate. We were here to conduct business. "Are you ready for this, Art?" Evelyn asked quietly, her eyes scanning the crowd. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, my gaze fixed on the frosted glass doors where the passengers would soon emerge. My heart was beating a steady, heavy rhythm in my chest, a slow drumbeat counting down to the final act. I felt a strange mix of dread and resolve. This was the final necessary surgery, and I was the one who had to hold the scalpel. We watched the flight status monitor click from landed to at gate. A few minutes later, the first wave of weary travelers trickled through the doors, squinting in the bright terminal lights. Businessmen on their phones, college students with backpacks, families herding tired children. Then, I saw them. They emerged as a single, stressed unit, pushing a cart piled high with luggage. They looked nothing like the vibrant, excited family that had left 3 weeks ago. Caleb's shoulders were slumped, his face pale and drawn beneath his vacation tan. Jenna's usually perfect hair was tied back in a messy bun, and she wore a tight, brittle expression. Her sister Brenda and her husband Rick trailed a few feet behind them, a tangible distance of anger and annoyance separating the two couples. The entire group radiated an aura of defeat. Before any of the adults even saw me, a small voice cut through the noise. "Grandpa!" My granddaughter Chloe had spotted me. Her face, which had been downturned and pouty, suddenly lit up with pure, uncomplicated joy. She dropped the handle of the small rolling bag she was pulling and broke into a run. "Grandpa Art!" Liam yelled, right behind her, his own weariness forgotten. They crashed into my legs, and I knelt, my old knees protesting, to wrap them both in a hug. Chloe's small arms circled my neck, and she buried her face in my shoulder. "We missed you," she mumbled into my jacket. The rest of the trip wasn't fun. I held them tight, breathing in the scent of them, a mix of airplane air and leftover childhood sweetness. In that moment, the lawyer, the will, the betrayal, it all melted away. I was just their grandfather, and they were just my grandchildren. A profound, aching sadness washed over me. They were the innocent cargo on a ship their parents had already steered into an iceberg. This wasn't their fault, yet they would bear the consequences just the same. "I missed you too," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "More than you know." I stood up slowly, keeping a hand on each of their shoulders, and finally met my son's eyes. Caleb had stopped dead in his tracks about 20 feet away. He stared at me, then his gaze slid to the impeccably dressed woman standing at my side. I watched his face cycle through a series of emotions with startling speed. First, confusion. Then, a dawning, horrified recognition. His weary expression evaporated, replaced by the panicked, cornered look of an animal that has just realized the trap it's in. Jenna saw it too. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with dread. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and sick. Caleb took a hesitant step forward, forcing a tense, unnatural smile onto his face. "Dad," he said, his voice strained. What are you doing here?" "We were just going to grab a cab." He was trying to pretend this was normal, a desperate, last-ditch effort to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling away from him. I gave Chloe's shoulder a gentle squeeze before looking my son squarely in the eye. My voice was calm, level, and carried a weight that made the space around us feel silent and still. "I thought I should be here to welcome you home, son," I said, "and to make sure you had a chance to meet my legal counsel." I gestured slightly toward Evelyn. "Caleb, Jenna, this is Miss Evelyn Reed." The formal introduction landed in the air between us, with the cold, heavy finality of a stone dropping into a deep, dark well. Caleb's forced smile faltered, his eyes darting between my calm expression and Evelyn's professional impassivity. The casual airport noise, rolling luggage, distant announcements, the chatter of families seemed to fade away, creating a pocket of tense, charged silence around our small group. Jenna took a half step back, pulling the luggage cart with her, as if to create a barricade. Her sister Brenda and her husband Rick, who had been hanging back, now took a few curious steps forward, sensing that this was more than just an awkward family reunion. They were about to get a front row seat to the demolition of a life plan. Evelyn Reed, without a word, opened her slim leather portfolio. The soft click of the latch was unnaturally loud in the silent space between us. She withdrew a thick, 9x12 envelope, sealed and marked with her firm's official return address. She stepped forward, her movements economical and precise, and extended the envelope not to me but directly to my son. "Mr. Caleb Vance," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "My client, Arthur Vance, has asked me to be present today to serve you with this document. It is a certified copy of his revised and fully executed last will and testament, filed with the state of Ohio on the 8th of September, 2025. Caleb stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. His hands trembled slightly as he took it. For a moment, he just stood there, holding the physical proof that his world was about to change. Then, with a jerky, angry motion, he tore the seal. He pulled out the thick stack of paper, and his eyes began to scan the first page, the legal jargon a dense forest he was trying to navigate. I watched his face, a mask of disbelief hardening into a scowl of pure fury. He flipped a page, then another, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. "What is this?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Charitable trust, primary beneficiary, What the hell is the Arthur and Eleanor Vance Scholarship? Jenna leaned over his shoulder, her perfectly manicured finger tracing the lines of text. Her face, already pale, went ashen. What does it mean, Caleb? She whispered, her voice tight with panic. Where are our names? Where are the kids' names? Caleb didn't answer. He had reached the clause, the one Evelyn had so carefully drafted. His head snapped up, and he looked at me, his eyes blazing with a desperate, impotent rage I had only heard over a crackling phone line. Now I could see it in person, and it was uglier than I could have imagined. Disinherited? He spat the word, his voice cracking. For financial exploitation and threatening behavior, this is insane. You can't do this. His voice was rising now, attracting stares from passers-by. A security guard nearby paused, his hand resting on his belt. I am your son, Caleb shouted, taking a menacing step toward me. This is my inheritance, our children's inheritance. That money is ours. The children, still standing by my side, flinched. Chloe buried her face in my jacket. This was the moment. The final confrontation I had spent weeks preparing for. I felt a strange calm settle over me. I did think of the children, Caleb, I said, my voice quiet but carrying clearly in the tense air. I thought of them when I established a scholarship fund that will help hundreds of children get a real start in life with a valuable skill. I decided that was a better use for my life's work than leaving it to a man who would simply burn through it to fund a lifestyle he didn't earn. I'll fight this, he roared, waving the papers in his fist. I will take you to court. I'll tell them you're old and confused, that you're not competent. I'll prove she manipulated you. He pointed a trembling finger at Evelyn, who didn't even blink. An inheritance is a gift, son, I said, my voice cutting through his tirade. It is not a right. It is a final acknowledgement of a lifetime of mutual love and respect. You forfeited your claim to that gift the moment you decided my money was more valuable than I was. You made your choice in the Seattle airport. This is the consequence. Jenna finally found her voice, a high-pitched, pleading whine. Art, for God's sake, think about what you're doing. Our house, the kids' school, this will ruin us. Your house and your children's school were your responsibility, Jenna, I replied, my voice hard as iron. Not mine. You and my son have been living on a subsidy for years. The subsidy has just ended. The finality in my tone seemed to break something in Caleb. His rage collapsed into a desperate, pathetic plea. Dad, please, he said, his voice suddenly weak. Don't do this. We can talk about it. We can pay you back for the trip. It was the saddest, most revealing sentence he could have possibly uttered. Even now, he thought this was about the money. He still didn't understand. There is nothing left to talk about, I said. I gently turned Liam and Chloe toward Brenda and Rick, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide, shocked eyes. Brenda, I said, my voice softening as I addressed her. Can you please see that the children get home safely? She just nodded, speechless, and took her niece and nephew by the hands. I knelt one last time and looked my grandchildren in the eyes. Grandpa loves you very much, I whispered. Never forget that. I stood up and looked at my son one last time. He was just a man in an airport, holding a stack of papers, his entire future, built on a foundation of lies, crumbling around him. There was no triumph in me, only a deep, profound sadness for the son I had lost so long ago. You told me on the phone that actions have consequences, Caleb, I said. You were right. This is the consequence of yours. And with that, I turned my back on him. Evelyn fell into step beside me, and together we walked toward the exit, not looking back. Behind me, I could hear Jenna begin to sob, a raw, ugly sound of loss. But I kept walking, leaving the wreckage of my old life behind me and heading toward the quiet dawn of my new one. A month has passed since the homecoming at the airport. The autumn chill has begun to settle over Ohio, and the leaves on the big maple in my front yard are starting to turn brilliant shades of red and gold. There have been no more frantic phone calls. There was one letter, about a week after the confrontation, from a law firm I'd never heard of. It was full of blustering threats and legal jargon, accusing me of everything from emotional distress to elder financial malfeasance. A truly inventive bit of fiction. I didn't even read the whole thing. I just passed it along to Evelyn, who handled it with a single, sharply worded response that made it clear any legal challenge would be a fool's errand. Since then, there has been only silence. A deep, profound, and welcome silence. I now wake up with the sun, not because I have to, but because I want to. This morning, like most mornings, I found myself in Eleanor's garden with a warm mug of coffee in hand. The air was crisp, and the dew was heavy on the last of the season's roses. The space has been transformed since that first terrible day I came back from Seattle. The weeds are gone, the soil is rich and turned, and I've spent the last few weeks planting tulip and daffodil bulbs, a promise to myself of the beauty that will come next spring. I am no longer just maintaining Eleanor's garden. I am adding to it. I am helping it grow. Tucked into the pocket of my work jacket is a letter, already folded and worn from being read so many times. It arrived yesterday. It's from a young woman in Cleveland, the first ever recipient of the Arthur and Eleanor Vance Scholarship. She wrote to tell me that the funds will allow her to complete her certification in welding, a trade her father and grandfather both practiced. My whole life, I've been told this isn't work for a woman, she wrote in a neat, strong cursive. Your scholarship isn't just helping me pay for my classes and my gear. It's a vote of confidence that someone out there believes in the work I want to do. I won't let you down. I read her words, and I don't feel anger toward my son. I don't feel the sting of betrayal. I feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Caleb's greed, in its own twisted way, was a gift. It forced me to see the rot in my own foundation. It forced me to stop patching a structure that was beyond repair and instead build something new, something better, something that will stand long after I'm gone. My legacy will not be a series of canceled checks to a son who saw me as a resource. It will be the hum of a welder's torch in Cleveland, the buzz of a saw in a carpentry shop in Cincinnati, the hiss of a plumber's iron in Dayton. It will be in the hands of hundreds of young people building their own lives, their own futures. I took a sip of my coffee and looked up as the sun crested the horizon, casting long, golden rays of light across the garden. The light illuminated the vibrant petals of a chrysanthemum, a flower that blooms brightest in the autumn, long after the others have faded. I feel a bit like that flower. The winter of my life is approaching, but I am not fading. I am blooming. I have lost a son, and the grief of that is a quiet, permanent ache in my heart. But I have reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my purpose. I have honored my wife's memory, not by visiting the past, but by building a better future. The silence of my house is no longer a void, but a peaceful sanctuary. It is the quiet of a life well lived, and a legacy finally and truly secured. If you enjoyed Arthur's story, please do me a favor and like this video, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, and share your thoughts in the comments below. To listen to our next story, you can click on the video box on your screen. Thank you for watching.